A white man finds a black baby girl abandoned in the trash, shivering and barely clinging to life. Against all odds, he takes her in, raising her as his own despite the whispers, the judgment, and the battles he never expected to fight. But years later, just as she's about to leave for college, the phone rings, and what he hears changes everything. The girl he saved isn't who he thought she was. Who left her there that night? And what secret has been buried for all these years? This is a story of love, sacrifice, and the truth that refuses to stay hidden. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The December wind whistled through the empty streets of Dawson, Georgia, carrying with it the bite of winter's chill and the musty scent of dead leaves. Frank Jackson hunched his shoulders against the cold, his weathered work jacket offering little protection against the biting air. His boots made a steady rhythm against the frozen ground as he walked home from his auto shop, each step heavy with the familiar weight of loneliness that had become his constant companion. The streetlights cast long shadows across Main Street, their dim glow barely reaching the darkened storefronts with their Christmas displays gathering dust. Frank kept his head down, his calloused hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his thoughts drifting to the empty house waiting for him. 5 years without Evelyn, and the silence still felt wrong, like a song missing its melody. As he passed Ruby's Diner, now closed for the night, its neon sign dark and lifeless, a sound caught his attention. At first, it was so faint he thought he'd imagined it, just another trick of the wind. He stopped, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, hovering like ghost stories in the night. There it was again, a muffled cry coming from the alley behind the diner. Probably just another stray, he muttered to himself, but his feet were already turning toward the sound, drawn by something he couldn't explain. The cry grew sharper, clearer, cutting through the winter stillness like a knife, and Frank's heart skipped a beat. That wasn't any cat, that was a baby. He moved faster, his work boots crunching on scattered gravel as he followed the sound to a large dumpster. His hands trembled as he approached, not from the cold, but from a growing sense of dread that settled in his stomach like lead. There, among discarded boxes and garbage bags, lay a small bundle wrapped in what looked like an old dish towel. The wailing stopped for a moment, replaced by weak whimpers that seemed to echo off the brick walls. Frank stood frozen, staring at the tiny face peeking out from the dirty blanket, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The baby girl's dark skin was flushed an angry red from the cold, her breaths coming in short, desperate gasps that formed tiny clouds in the frigid air. "Dear Lord," he whispered, his mind racing through possibilities like cards in a shuffled deck. He should call someone, the police, child services, anyone. But experience had taught him hard lessons about how the system worked, especially for black children in a town like Dawson. He'd seen too many kids shuffled through foster homes, treated like numbers instead of people, their futures decided by overworked social workers and indifferent judges. Evelyn's voice echoed in his memory clear as day, as if she were standing right beside him. "Frank Jackson, you've got the softest heart of any man I've ever known. You just hide it under all that gruffness, like a pearl in an oyster shell." Without letting himself think too hard about what he was doing, Frank reached down and scooped up the bundle, his movements gentle despite his rough hands. The baby felt impossibly small against his chest, her tiny body shivering like an autumn leaf in the wind. He opened his jacket and tucked her inside, trying to share what warmth he could, feeling her settle against him as if she'd found her place in the world. His old pickup truck sat where he'd left it in front of the diner, its faded blue paint looking more reliable than ever in the dim light. The engine grumbled to life like an old dog waking from sleep, the heater slowly warming the cab as they drove through the quiet streets. Every few seconds, Frank glanced down at the baby, making sure she was still breathing, watching the small rise and fall of her chest. Back home, he gently placed her on his worn couch, its familiar cushions accepting her tiny weight without complaint. His hands were shaking as he retrieved Evelyn's favorite quilt from the closet, the one she'd made herself during their first year of marriage. The soft purple fabric still held a hint of her lavender perfume, a ghost of memory that brought tears to his eyes. He wrapped the baby carefully, watching as her crying finally settled into quiet hiccups that seemed to match the ticking of the old wall clock. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the child, his voice rough with emotion. The baby's dark eyes fixed on his face, serious and somehow knowing, as if she'd already decided this was exactly where she belonged, in this moment, in this place, with him. The next morning's pale sunlight had barely crept through Frank's windows when a sharp knock jolted him awake. He'd dozed off in his armchair, the baby nestled safely in a makeshift bed of blankets on the couch nearby. His neck ached from the awkward position and his mouth felt dry. Another knock, more insistent this time, echoed through the quiet house. Through the frosted glass of his front door, he could make out the familiar silhouette of Doris Calhoun, her gray hair perfectly coiffed even at this early hour. The neighborhood busybody never missed a chance to stick her nose where it didn't belong. Frank rubbed his eyes and opened the door just enough to block her view inside, letting the cool morning air rush past him. "Frank Jackson, is that a baby I hear in there?" Doris's neck craned to peer around him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Her floral perfume was overwhelming, even from the doorway. "Morning's not the time for visits, Doris," Frank said gruffly, but a soft cry from inside betrayed him. His heart skipped a beat at the sound. "It is a baby," Doris gasped, her hand flying to her chest, pearls clicking against her blouse. "Where on earth did you get a baby?" Frank closed the door without answering, but he knew it was already too late. In Dawson, news traveled faster than summer lightning, spreading like wildfire through phone lines and over fence posts, and by mid-morning, police cruisers pulled up to his house, their lights silent but their presence loud enough to draw curtain-twitching neighbors to their windows. Sheriff Tom Walker stood on his porch, notebook in hand, his badge catching the late morning sun. "Frank, we need to talk about this baby situation. Why didn't you report finding her?" His tone was professional but carried an edge of concern. "Nothing to report, Tom. I'm taking care of her myself." Frank's voice was firm, his stance unwavering as he planted his feet solidly on the wooden boards of his porch. The sheriff gave him a long, hard look, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "This isn't something you can just decide on your own, Frank. There are procedures." But Frank stood his ground, arms crossed over his chest, and eventually, the sheriff left, though his departure felt more like a temporary retreat than a surrender. The crunch of gravel under his boots echoed Frank's determination. The whispers started at the grocery store, spread through church pews, and reached full volume by afternoon. Heads turned when he walked past, conversations hushed mid-sentence. Earl Simmons stormed into Frank's auto shop, his face red with anger and disbelief, screen door slamming behind him. "Raising one of them? Frank, you've lost your damn mind." Earl's voice echoed off the garage walls, bouncing between tool chests and spare parts. "What would Evelyn think?" Frank continued working on the engine in front of him, his hands steady despite his rising anger, grease-stained fingers gripping the wrench tighter. "Don't you dare bring Evelyn into this." The shop phone stopped ringing as often after that. Regular customers suddenly found other mechanics, leaving Frank's parking lot emptier than it had been in years. The silence in the garage grew heavier with each passing day. As evening settled over Dawson, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, a sharp-dressed woman arrived at Frank's door. Lynn Waller introduced herself as a social worker, her clipboard already full of notes before she'd even stepped inside. Her heels clicked purposefully across his worn hardwood floor. "Mr. Jackson," she said, sitting primly on his couch, smoothing her pencil skirt with manicured hands, "I need you to understand the challenges here. A white man raising a black child in this town. It won't be easy. The child will face confusion, identity issues. Are you prepared for that?" Frank looked at the baby girl who was watching him with those same knowing eyes from the night before, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. "Her name's Hope," he said simply, making the decision final. The name felt right, settling into his heart like it had always belonged there. He met Ms. Waller's gaze with unwavering certainty. "And I'm not letting her go." The first few days with Hope tested every ounce of Frank's patience and strength. His large, work-roughened hands fumbled with tiny diaper tabs and delicate bottle nipples. Each task felt like trying to fix a carburetor while wearing boxing gloves. Even simple things like changing her clothes became a test of dexterity and nerve, leaving him sweating and muttering under his breath. One particularly difficult night, Hope's cries pierced the silence of his small house. Frank paced the living room, dark circles under his eyes, trying to prepare her bottle while she wailed in his arms. The formula clumped stubbornly, refusing to mix properly. The kitchen clock ticked away mercilessly, marking each moment of his struggle. "Come on, sweetheart," he pleaded, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Just give me a minute here." But Hope only cried harder, her tiny face scrunched and red, tears rolling down her cheeks. Frank's hands shook as he tested the temperature on his wrist, spilling drops of formula on the counter. For a moment, doubt crept in like a shadow, whispering that maybe everyone else was right. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. The news of the custody hearing hit him like a punch to the gut. Lynn Waller delivered it with clinical precision in his kitchen, her pen tapping against her clipboard, her eyes coolly assessing every detail of his home. "The judge needs to evaluate your fitness as a guardian, Mr. Jackson. If things don't go well, Hope will be placed in the foster system." Her words hung heavy in the air between them. Desperate for help, Frank swallowed his pride and visited Miss Ruby at her small house on the edge of town. The screen door creaked as she opened it, and the smell of fresh baked cornbread wafted out. She took one look at Hope's dry, ashy skin and Frank's bewildered expression and shook her head. "Lord have mercy, Jackson," she said, ushering him inside. "You can't treat this child's skin like yours." She led him to her bathroom, pulling out various lotions and oils from a worn wicker basket. "Watch and learn." Miss Ruby's hands moved with practiced care as she demonstrated how to moisturize Hope's skin and properly care for her hair. Her fingers worked through Hope's tiny curls with gentle expertise. "You see these curls forming? They need special attention. You can't just wash and go like with your hair." The baby cooed contentedly under Miss Ruby's touch. Frank watched intently, taking mental notes as Miss Ruby explained each step, his face set with determination. "You got good intentions, Jackson," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But love ain't enough. You gotta learn." Her eyes met his in the bathroom mirror, full of both challenge and compassion. The morning of the custody hearing arrived with a heavy weight of uncertainty. Frank put on his best suit, the one he'd worn to Evelyn's funeral, carefully smoothing down the lapels with trembling hands. He dressed Hope in a tiny yellow dress Miss Ruby had given them, making sure each bow was perfectly tied. The courthouse loomed before them, its brick facade stern and imposing in the morning light. Inside the courtroom, Frank felt small under the judge's scrutinizing gaze. The man's expression remained neutral as he reviewed the case files, the shuffle of papers the only sound in the tense room. His questions were sharp and probing, each one making Frank's collar feel tighter. Lynn Waller presented her concerns about Frank's qualifications, his lack of experience, the cultural challenges, her voice carrying an undertone of doubt that made his jaw clench. When the judge finally spoke, his words were measured, each one falling like a stone. "Mr. Jackson, while I appreciate your unusual commitment, this situation requires careful oversight." He granted temporary guardianship, but with conditions: regular visits from social services, mandatory parenting classes, and cultural sensitivity training. The relief Frank felt was tempered by the weight of these requirements. As Frank walked out of the courtroom, Hope sleeping peacefully against his shoulder, her warm breath tickling his neck, Earl Simmons stood waiting in the hallway. His old friend's face was twisted with disapproval, eyes hard with judgment. "You're making a mistake," Earl muttered, just loud enough for Frank to hear, his words dripping with contempt. Frank's free hand clenched into a fist at his side, but he kept walking, holding Hope just a little bit closer, his chin lifted with quiet defiance. Each step away from Earl felt like a statement, a choice being made over and over again. Frank's once orderly house had transformed into a maze of baby toys, blankets, and scattered supplies. Hope, now 6 months old, was a force of nature, her tiny hands reaching for everything in sight. She babbled constantly, a stream of happy sounds that filled the once quiet rooms with life. Stuffed animals perched precariously on every surface, and the living room floor had become a patchwork of colorful playmats and soft toys. One morning, as Frank pushed the shopping cart through Mason's grocery, Hope sat in the baby seat, her bright eyes taking in everything around her. She reached for a box of cereal, knocking it off the shelf. Her delighted giggle echoed through the aisle as Frank bent to pick it up. A white woman in a floral dress walked past, her pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light, her face twisted with disgust. "That ain't right," she whispered, loud enough for Frank to hear, her lips pursed like she'd tasted something sour. Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on Hope, who was now trying to grab his nose with her chubby fingers. A few aisles over, an elderly black woman caught his eye. Her weathered face softened as she gave him a small, approving nod before continuing her shopping, saying nothing but communicating volumes in that simple gesture. At the auto shop, the changes were becoming harder to ignore. The phone rang less often, and the appointment book had more blank spaces than ever before. Dust gathered in corners that used to be busy with customers. That afternoon, Tom Miller, who'd been bringing his trucks to Frank for 15 years, walked in for his usual oil change, his work boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. When he saw Hope sleeping peacefully in her carrier behind the counter, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, his face darkened. "I'll take my business elsewhere," Tom announced, turning on his heel and walking out, the bell above the door jingling harshly. Frank gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, but kept quiet. The familiar smell of motor oil and grease suddenly felt heavy in his throat. Hope stirred in her sleep, and his anger melted away as he watched her peaceful face, her long eyelashes fluttering against her cheeks. Later that night, after putting Hope down for a nap, Frank sat at his kitchen table surrounded by bills and bank statements, the lamp casting long shadows across the worn wood. The numbers didn't lie. His savings were shrinking faster than he'd expected. Coffee gone cold beside him, he rubbed his tired eyes, wondering how long he could keep the shop running at this rate. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Miss Ruby stood there, holding a small bag of hair supplies, her familiar floral perfume wafting in with the evening air. "Time for her first proper braiding," she announced, walking past him without waiting for an invitation, her sensible shoes clicking against the floor. Hope sat in Frank's lap while Miss Ruby demonstrated the technique, her experienced hands moving with practiced grace. Frank's large fingers fumbled with the tiny braids at first, but he was determined to learn. The little girl stayed surprisingly still, entertained by the cartoon playing on TV. After several attempts, he managed to complete one small, slightly crooked braid. Miss Ruby inspected his work with a critical eye, then broke into an amused smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You ain't half bad, Jackson," she said, adjusting the braid slightly. "But you got a long road ahead." Her voice carried equal measures of approval and challenge. That evening, as Frank tucked Hope into her crib, he watched her yawn and stretch her little arms, her favorite yellow blanket clutched tight in one hand. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on her face. "No matter what happens," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't leaving you behind." Hope's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, holding on tight, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. In that moment, something shifted inside Frank's heart, settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle. For the first time since finding her in that alley, he didn't feel like just a man taking care of a baby. He felt like a father. The late afternoon sun streamed through the living room windows as Hope pulled herself up using the coffee table. Frank watched, his heart racing and hands trembling slightly as she wobbled on unsteady legs. Her dark curls bounced as she took one tentative step then another, her tiny feet padding against the worn carpet. "That's it, baby girl," Frank encouraged softly, not wanting to startle her. His voice was barely above a whisper. Hope's face lit up with determination, her tiny fingers releasing their grip on the table. She stood alone for a moment, swaying like a tree in the wind, before taking 3 wobbly steps toward Frank, her arms outstretched for balance. His chest swelled with pride as she toddled forward, her face a picture of concentration. Instinctively, he reached for the old camera on the shelf, then remembered he hadn't bought film in months. The money had been too tight, with every spare dollar going to diapers and formula. Hope plopped down on her bottom, giggling, and the moment passed uncaptured except in his memory, where it would stay forever bright and clear. At the auto shop, the silence was becoming deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The empty parking lot told its own story, one of prejudice wrapped in small-town politics and whispered conversations. Frank wiped his hands on a rag, staring at the vacant service bay where cars used to line up for repairs, the oil stains on the concrete, the only evidence of busier times. The bell above the door jangled, and Earl Simmons walked in, his boots leaving dusty prints on the floor. He stood with his arms crossed, looking around the empty shop with exaggerated concern, his lips curled in a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You had a good thing here, Frank," Earl said, shaking his head slowly. "Why throw it away? All these years of building something just to watch it crumble." Frank's jaw tightened as he tossed the rag aside, the fabric landing with a soft thump on his toolbox. "I ain't throwing anything away, Earl. These people are choosing to leave. That's on them, not me." "Because you're raising one of them," Earl spat, his face reddening. "It ain't natural, and you know it. The whole town knows it." "Her name is Hope," Frank growled, stepping forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "And I don't need your approval or anyone else's. Never have, never will." Earl backed toward the door, his face twisted with disgust, his hand finding the doorknob behind him. "Your daddy would be ashamed of what you've done to this place. You're ruining everything he built." After Earl left, Frank sat at his desk, staring at the stack of unpaid bills that seemed to grow taller every day. The numbers didn't lie. He was barely covering expenses, and winter was coming. In his bottom drawer, his old military pension paperwork sat like a last resort, dog-eared and yellowing. He pulled it out, running his fingers over the worn edges, wondering if selling the shop was becoming less of a choice and more of a necessity, the thought sitting heavy in his stomach. That evening, Frank spooned mashed peas into Hope's mouth, making airplane noises that made her laugh and clap, her high chair covered in green splotches. Her dark eyes sparkled with joy as she reached for the spoon, making more mess than progress, but he couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. A piece of paper on the kitchen table caught his attention, the edges curling slightly. Hope had been scribbling with crayons earlier, and there, in wobbly lines and uncertain shapes, was what could only be the two of them. She had drawn herself with a wide, crooked smile, and next to her was a bigger figure, him, with his usual serious expression, their stick-figure hands connected. Frank picked up the drawing, something catching in his throat as he traced the crayon lines with his finger. Hope babbled, "Da da," and reached for him with pea-covered hands, her smile bright enough to chase away the shadows of the day. "We'll figure it out, kid," he sighed, wiping her face with a damp cloth, his touch gentle. "Somehow, we always do." Frank noticed Hope's flushed cheeks during breakfast. When he touched her forehead, the heat radiating from her skin made his heart skip. Without hesitation, he bundled her up in her favorite purple blanket and drove to Dawson's only pediatric clinic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as Hope whimpered in her car seat. Every small cry felt like a knife in his chest. The waiting room buzzed with activity, crying babies, running toddlers, and worried parents shuffling through old magazines. The scent of disinfectant hung heavy in the air. Frank approached the reception desk, hope burning against his chest, her small hands clutching weakly at his shirt collar. The nurse behind the counter barely glanced up from her paperwork, her pen scratching loudly against the forms. "Fill these out," she muttered, sliding some forms across the counter with a flick of her wrist. Frank's hands trembled as he wrote, checking Hope's temperature again. 102.4. The numbers glared back at him like an accusation. He returned the papers quickly, but the nurse just added them to a stack without looking, continuing her work as if they were invisible. 1 hour passed, then 2. The ancient wall clock ticked mockingly as Frank watched other families, all white, arrive after them, but were called back first. Hope's crying grew weaker, her little body limp against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and warm against his neck. He approached the desk again, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear and anger churning in his gut. My daughter's burning up. We've been waiting for hours." The nurse finally looked at him, her lips curling into an expression that made his blood boil. "We'll get to your child when we can." She emphasized each word as if they left a bad taste in her mouth. A black woman sitting nearby stood up, her own toddler on her hip. "She's burning up and y'all just ignoring her?" She snapped at the staff, her voice carrying through the waiting room. "That baby needs help now. Don't think we don't see what's happening here." The commotion finally got them attention. A doctor appeared, looking annoyed at the disruption, and led them to an exam room that felt too small and too cold. But instead of focusing on Hope, he stared at Frank with barely concealed disdain, his eyes full of judgment. "You should be aware of the challenges she'll face growing up," the doctor said while checking Hope's ears, his movements brusque and impersonal. "You're not exactly equipped to teach her about her culture. Have you considered that?" Frank's jaw clenched so tight it hurt, his teeth grinding together as he fought back the words he wanted to say. The doctor prescribed antibiotics for an ear infection, his instructions delivered with the same condescending tone that made Frank's skin crawl. Later that night, Hope slept peacefully in her crib, her fever reduced by medicine, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Frank sat at the kitchen table, a beer bottle sweating in his grip, leaving a ring of condensation on the worn wood. The day's events played over in his mind. The nurse's sneers, the doctor's judgment, the waiting room full of people who saw his daughter as less worthy of care. The memory of each slight burned fresh in his mind. He took a long pull from the bottle, his throat tight with emotion. The question that had been gnawing at him all day finally surfaced, impossible to ignore. How could he prepare Hope for a world that treated her this way? What if he wasn't enough? The silence of the house offered no answers, only the soft sound of his daughter's breathing through the baby monitor. Months have passed and life hasn't gotten any easier. Frank stood in the bathroom, staring at Hope's hair with growing frustration. Her beautiful black curls had transformed into a wild, frizzy cloud that seemed to defy gravity, making him feel completely out of his depth. The drugstore shampoo bottle sat accusingly on the counter, the same brand he'd used for years on his own hair, its familiar blue label now mocking his ignorance. "Hold still, sweetheart," he muttered, trying to run a regular brush through the tangles. His calloused mechanic's hands, so skilled with engines, felt clumsy and inadequate for this delicate task. Hope squirmed on the bathroom stool, whimpering as the brush caught in her hair, tears forming in her big brown eyes. "Ow, Daddy!" Her bottom lip trembled, and Frank immediately dropped the brush, his heart aching. The sound of her pain felt like a physical blow to his chest. At the grocery store later that morning, Hope's hair stuck out in all directions despite Frank's attempts to smooth it down with water. The fluorescent lights seemed to highlight every untamed strand. He pushed the shopping cart down the cereal aisle, trying to ignore the stares from other shoppers, some pitying, others judgmental. A familiar laugh cut through the air, warm and knowing. "What in the world did you do to that baby's hair?" Miss Ruby stood there, shaking her head, her hands on her hips. Her colorful dress seemed to brighten the whole aisle as she reached out and touched Hope's hair, clicking her tongue disapprovingly. Hope instinctively leaned into the gentle touch. "Lord have mercy, Frank Jackson, you're coming with me right now." She grabbed his card and started pushing it toward the checkout, her bracelets jingling with determination. "This is an emergency, and you know I don't say that lightly." 20 minutes later, Frank found himself sitting in Miss Ruby's warm, familiar kitchen, surrounded by an array of bottles, oils, and combs he'd never seen before. The air smelled of coconut and something sweet he couldn't identify. Hope sat contentedly in Miss Ruby's lap, munching on homemade butter cookies while the older woman carefully sectioned her hair with practiced movements. "Watch close now," Miss Ruby instructed, demonstrating how to apply coconut oil to Hope's scalp. Her fingers moved with the confidence of decades of experience. "You can fight for that girl all you want, but if you don't know how to take care of her, she's going to resent you for it. And I won't have that happening on my watch." Frank leaned forward, concentrating as Miss Ruby showed him how to use a wide-tooth comb, starting from the ends and working up to prevent breakage. His face was set with the same intense focus he used when diagnosing a troubled engine. She explained about protective styles, moisturizing, and the importance of a silk pillowcase, punctuating each lesson with personal anecdotes and generations of wisdom. "I want you to swear right here and now," Miss Ruby said, pointing the comb at Frank's chest like a sword, her eyes serious but kind, "that you won't touch this child's hair without my help until you learn proper. This isn't just about looking pretty, it's about dignity and self-respect." "Yes, ma'am," Frank replied, feeling both chastised and grateful. He recognized this moment for what it was, not just a hair lesson, but a bridge between worlds. When Miss Ruby finished, Hope's hair was transformed into neat, beautiful braids adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. The little girl couldn't stop touching them. Her face lit up with joy as she admired herself in Miss Ruby's antique mirror, turning her head from side to side to watch the beads catch the light. Frank watched his daughter beam at her reflection, his chest tight with emotion. The sight of her happiness made his earlier frustration worth it. He still had so much to learn, but seeing Hope's radiant smile made him determined to master every lesson Miss Ruby could teach him, no matter how many tries it took. Frank watched Hope pack her tiny backpack with careful precision, folding her favorite pajamas just like he'd taught her. Her excitement filled their small house like sunshine through open windows as she chattered about the sleepover at Maggie's, her very first one. She'd been talking about nothing else for days, ever since the invitation came during preschool snack time. "And we're gonna watch movies and eat popcorn and stay up late. Maggie says her mom makes the best chocolate chip cookies." She bounced on her toes, her braids swinging with each hop, her smile bright enough to light up the whole room. Frank smiled, but worry gnawed at his stomach like a persistent ache. He'd met Maggie's parents only briefly at preschool pickup. They'd been polite enough, if a bit stiff, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Still, Hope deserved this normal childhood experience just like any other little girl her age. "Remember to say please and thank you," he reminded her, helping her zip up the sparkly purple backpack she'd picked out herself. "And call me if you need anything. Doesn't matter what time. I mean it, okay?" "I know, Daddy." Hope hugged his legs tight before skipping to the door, practically vibrating with excitement. The drive to Maggie's house was short, winding through familiar neighborhood streets. Hope sang along to the radio, her small voice filling the truck cab with joy, making up half the words, but not caring one bit. Frank watched her skip up the pathway to Maggie's front door, where her friend waited in pink pajamas, both girls squealing in delight and immediately holding hands. But just 3 hours later, his doorbell rang, shattering the quiet evening. There stood Hope, clutching her backpack with trembling fingers, her bottom lip trembling, and her eyes swimming with unshed tears. Behind her, Maggie's father shifted uncomfortably on the porch before hurrying back to his idling car without a word of explanation. "Baby, what happened?" Frank knelt down on the worn welcome mat, his heart breaking at her confused expression, at the way her shoulders hunched inward. Hope's voice came out small and hurt, barely above a whisper. "Maggie's mom said I had to leave. She wouldn't let me stay for cookies." Something hot and fierce rose in Frank's chest, a familiar protective rage he'd learned to control but never quite suppress. He made sure Hope was settled with her favorite stuffed animal, a worn pink elephant named Rosie, before driving to Maggie's house, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, jaw clenched against words he couldn't let loose. Maggie's mother answered his knock, her face pinched with discomfort, still wearing the same perfect pastel sweater set from earlier. When Frank demanded an explanation, she wouldn't meet his eyes, instead focusing on a point somewhere over his shoulder. We have different upbringings," she stammered, wringing her hands like she was trying to wash them clean. "I didn't want to cause any problems. You understand, don't you?" Frank stood there, letting the weight of her words sink in. He didn't yell or curse. His silence spoke volumes, heavy with years of similar encounters. The disappointment in his eyes made her step back slightly, as if his gaze carried physical weight. "Different upbringings," he repeated slowly, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest like hot coals. "That's what you're teaching your daughter? That's the lesson you want her to learn?" The woman had no response, just closed the door softly, the click of the lock echoing in the growing darkness. Back home, Frank found Hope sitting on her bed, still in her day clothes. Rosie clutched tight against her chest. Her usually bright eyes were clouded with confusion and hurt, staring at nothing. He sat beside her, the old bed creaking under his weight, gathering her small frame into his arms. "It's not your fault, baby girl," he whispered into her hair, breathing in the coconut scent of her shampoo. "Not one bit your fault. Some people they just don't understand yet." Hope's small hand found his, gripping it tight enough to hurt. In that moment, Frank saw something shift in her eyes, the first flicker of understanding about why some people treated her differently. His heart ached, knowing this wouldn't be the last time she'd face such rejection, knowing he couldn't shield her from every cruel reality of the world, no matter how much he wished he could. Years have passed as Frank helped Hope get ready for her first day of kindergarten. Her new backpack sat on the bed, decorated with colorful butterflies that sparkled when they caught the light. Frank went through it one more time. Lunchbox, pencil case, folder, and the small family photo he'd slipped in when she wasn't looking. He'd chosen that particular picture carefully, the two of them at the county fair last summer, both grinning wide with cotton candy-stained lips. "You excited, kiddo?" Frank asked, watching Hope fidget with her freshly pressed uniform. The crisp white collar stood stark against her dark skin, and the pleated navy skirt still held its store-bought creases. She gave a small nod, but her tiny fingers gripped his sleeve so tight he could feel her trembling. The walk to the school gates felt longer than usual. Other parents gathered in clusters, their children bouncing around them in identical uniforms. As Frank and Hope approached, conversations hushed. Mothers turned their heads together, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes following the pair's every move. Fathers stared openly, their disapproval plain on their faces, some even taking deliberate steps back as Frank and Hope passed by. Frank kept his eyes straight ahead, focusing instead on Hope's hand in his, the way her small fingers intertwined with his larger ones. At the entrance, he knelt down to her level, his knees creaking against the concrete. Her brown eyes were wide with uncertainty, darting between his face and the school building looming behind him, its red brick walls suddenly seeming more intimidating than welcoming. "You'll be great," he promised, straightening the bow in her hair one last time. The yellow ribbon matched the butterflies on her backpack, her favorite color this week. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Patterson stood at the door, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her skin uncomfortably. She offered Hope a polite smile, but barely glanced at Frank, her lips pressing into a thin line as she ushered Hope inside, her hand hovering near Hope's shoulder without quite touching it. Hope found her assigned seat at a round table with 4 other children. The blue plastic chairs squeaked against the linoleum floor as the kids shifted nervously. A little boy with red hair and freckles stared at her, his nose scrunched up in confusion. "You don't look like your daddy," he announced loudly, making the other kids turn to look, their curious eyes moving back and forth between Hope and the memory of Frank. Hope's face fell slightly, her small shoulders tensing beneath the stiff fabric of her uniform. "Yes, I do," she insisted, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. She touched her hair self-consciously, the braids Frank had carefully done that morning after watching countless YouTube tutorials. When Frank picked her up that afternoon, the usual bounce was missing from her step, her brand new shoes scuffed against the sidewalk as she walked. Her answers to his questions about her day came in short, quiet responses, nothing like her usual chatty self. During dinner, she pushed her mac and cheese around her plate, lost in thought, the cheese sauce growing cold and congealed. It wasn't until bedtime, when Frank was tucking her under her favorite purple comforter, that Hope finally spoke what was on her mind. "Am I supposed to have a daddy that looks like me?" she whispered, her voice small in the dim light of her bedroom. The glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling cast faint shadows across her worried face. Frank's heart clenched painfully in his chest. He sat on the edge of her bed, the old springs creaking under his weight. Drawing her close, he could smell the coconut shampoo in her hair, feel her small body trembling slightly against his side. The question hung heavy in the air between them, weighted with all the conversations he knew they'd have to face in the years ahead. "Families look all kinds of ways, kiddo," he said softly, searching for the right words. "I wouldn't trade you for anything." He hugged her tighter, trying to pour all his love and certainty into that embrace. Hope nodded against his chest, but Frank could feel the tension still in her shoulders, could see the questions swimming in her eyes. This was just the beginning, and they both knew it. The road ahead would be filled with more questions, more stares, more whispers, but he silently vowed to face each one together, just as they always had. Hope twirled in front of the mirror, her new party dress spinning out in a perfect circle. The purple fabric sparkled with tiny silver stars, catching the afternoon light streaming through her bedroom window. Her braids were tied with matching ribbons that Frank had carefully arranged that morning, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. Her eyes shone with excitement as she admired her reflection, touching the delicate fabric with reverent fingers. "Do you think Emily will like my dress?" Hope asked, smoothing down the front for the 100th time. She'd been talking about nothing else for days, ever since the invitation arrived. Frank nodded, watching her from the doorway with a tender smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She'd be crazy not to, kiddo. You look beautiful." His heart felt lighter seeing her so happy. After weeks of quiet lunches alone at school, Emily's party invitation had brought back Hope's bright smile, the one he'd been missing so much lately. When they pulled up to Emily's house in Frank's old truck, balloons bobbed cheerfully from the mailbox, their bright colors dancing in the breeze. Music and children's laughter drifted from the backyard, mixing with the sound of running feet and excited squeals. Hope practically bounced out of her seat, clutching her carefully wrapped present, a book she'd picked out herself and insisted on wrapping 3 times to make it perfect. Emily's mother opened the door, her welcoming smile freezing as she took in the sight of them. The warmth in her eyes turned to ice in an instant. "Oh, I didn't realize Hope was—" She stopped abruptly, her lips pressing into a thin line, her knuckles white against the doorframe. Frank's stomach nodded, recognizing that all-too-familiar look, the one that always made his jaw clench. Hope didn't notice the tension, already spotting Emily in the backyard through the open door. "Can I go play?" she asked eagerly, practically vibrating with excitement. Frank nodded, watching her skip away to join the other children, her purple dress catching the sunlight. For an hour, everything seemed fine. Hope played games, laughed, and ran around with the other kids, her face flushed with joy. Frank stood awkwardly among the other parents on the patio, who gave him a wide berth, their conversations stopping whenever he came near, replaced by pointed whispers and sidelong glances. Then came time for cake. The children gathered around the picnic table, their faces glowing in the light of the candles. After Emily made her wish, sending a puff of smoke into the warm afternoon air, her mother began cutting slices. One by one, paper plates filled with cake were handed out, each topped with a perfect swirl of frosting. Hope waited patiently at the end of the line, her eyes bright with anticipation, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. But when she stepped forward for her piece, Emily's mother shook her head, her voice syrupy sweet but her eyes cold. "Oh, I'm so sorry. We don't have enough slices." She didn't meet Frank's eyes as she said it, though there was clearly plenty of cake left on the platter, enough for several more pieces. Hope's face fell, her earlier joy crumpling like tissue paper. "But," she started to say, looking confused, her small shoulders drooping beneath the sparkling fabric. Frank was already moving, his hands clenched at his sides, barely containing his anger. He gently took Hope's hand, feeling it trembling in his. "Come on, sweetheart. We're leaving." In the truck, Hope's sniffles broke the silence. "She said there wasn't enough cake," she whispered, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, smudging the glitter on her cheeks. Her perfect party dress now seemed to mock their hopes for the afternoon. Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white, fighting back the angry words he wanted to say. Instead, he reached over and squeezed her hand, his touch gentle despite his rage. "Some folks don't know how to be kind," he said softly. "But that's their problem, not yours." That evening, Miss Ruby showed up at their door carrying a chocolate cake, decorated with swirls of purple frosting, Hope's favorite color. The cake was still warm from the oven, filling their house with its sweet aroma. Hope's eyes lit up at the sight, some of the sparkle returning to her expression. They sat around the kitchen table together, the cake between them, its candles casting a warm glow over their faces. Hope giggled as Frank accidentally got frosting on his nose, her earlier tears forgotten in the warmth of their small kitchen. Miss Ruby told stories that made them both laugh, her wise eyes twinkling as she watched Hope's smile grow wider with each bite of cake. In that moment, their little family felt complete, bound together by something stronger than any party invitation could break. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Frank's driveway as he scrubbed at a stubborn spot on his truck's hood, his weathered hands moving in small circles. The soapy water dripped down the faded blue paint, catching glints of light and creating rainbow patterns on the metal surface. Behind him, the rhythmic slap of Hope's jump rope against the concrete created a steady rhythm, accompanied by her quiet counting, the sound as familiar and comforting as a heartbeat. 31, 32, 33, 34. The peaceful moment shattered as police sirens wailed through the quiet neighborhood, growing louder until 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of their house, their lights flashing against the neighboring windows like angry red and blue lightning. Frank straightened up, his spine stiffening as he dropped his wash rag into the bucket with a splash. His heart hammered against his ribs as Deputy Riley stepped out, adjusting his belt with practiced authority, his boots crunching on the gravel. "We got a report about a disturbance here," Riley said, his hand resting casually near his holster, a gesture that seemed anything but casual to Frank. His eyes swept over the scene, the sudsy truck, the abandoned jump rope lying like a forgotten snake on the concrete, Hope frozen mid-step on the sidewalk, her small face a mask of confusion. Frank's mouth went dry as cotton. A disturbance? He wiped his hands slowly on his jeans, fighting to keep his voice steady even as anger began to simmer in his chest. "It's just me and my daughter out here, washing the truck and playing." The second officer, a younger man Frank didn't recognize, approached Hope with what he probably thought was a friendly smile, but came across as condescending. "Sweetie, is this man your daddy?" he asked, bending down to her level. Hope's eyes darted between the officers and Frank, her small fingers twisting nervously in her t-shirt, wrinkling the fabric. "Yeah," she said quietly, confusion written across her face. "He's my daddy." The officers exchanged meaningful looks, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they finally left, their sirens silent this time, their departure as sudden as their arrival. Frank watched their cars disappear around the corner, his hands shaking with suppressed anger and frustration that threatened to boil over. Later that evening, Miss Ruby came by, her face tight with barely contained fury, her usual warm demeanor replaced by righteous anger. She confirmed what Frank had already suspected. Doris Calhoun, his next-door neighbor with the perfectly manicured lawn and judgmental eyes, had made the call. The same woman who'd questioned Hope's presence in his house that very first morning, her words dripping with barely disguised suspicion. "Said it didn't look right. A white man raising a black girl," Ruby muttered, shaking her head so her silver earrings caught the kitchen light. Her fingers drummed against the kitchen counter in an agitated rhythm. "That woman's got nothing better to do than cause trouble. Been that way since I was a girl myself." After Ruby left and Hope went to bed, Frank sat in his living room, slouched in his favorite armchair, the house quiet except for the tick of the old wall clock that had belonged to his grandmother. The evening's events played over and over in his mind like a broken record. His daughter had been playing in her own yard, doing nothing wrong except existing in a space some people thought she shouldn't occupy. And someone had called the police simply because she didn't match him. He looked down at his clenched fists resting on his knees, the knuckles white with tension. What would happen when Hope was older, when she was a teenager? Would every moment they spent together be questioned by someone who thought they had the right to decide what a family should look like? Would she always have to prove she belonged in her own home? The sound of Hope's steady breathing drifted from her bedroom down the hall, peaceful and innocent. Frank's jaw tightened with determination. He wasn't going to let this town make her feel like she didn't belong. Not now, not ever. They were family, and no amount of sirens or suspicious neighbors could change that truth. Hope sat at the kitchen table, her homework spread out before her, but her mind seemed elsewhere. Her pencil tapped against her math worksheet as she studied Frank's face with a thoughtfulness that made her seem older than her 7 years. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "Why does my skin look different from yours?" Frank set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her. He'd been expecting this question, but his heart still skipped a beat. "People come in all shades, kiddo," he said carefully, keeping his voice gentle and matter-of-fact. Hope nodded slowly, but her eyes held more questions. Frank could see them forming like storm clouds on the horizon. She went back to her homework, but the pencil stayed still in her hand. Later that evening, they settled on the worn couch to watch the news together, their usual after-dinner routine. The TV cast a blue glow across their faces as a reporter spoke about a black teenager who'd been arrested for walking through an upscale neighborhood. The boy had simply been heading home from basketball practice. Hope's small body tensed beside Frank. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. "Would that happen to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank's chest tightened painfully. He'd known this moment would come, but nothing had prepared him for it. This was the talk, the one he knew black parents had with their children, the one about staying safe in a world that might see them as a threat. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "You gotta be careful, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Some folks will see your skin before they see who you are." Hope turned to face him fully now, her eyes serious and searching. "But you'd protect me, right?" Frank swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "Always," he promised. "But I need you to be smart, too." They spent the next hour talking about what to do if stopped by police, how to carry herself in stores so people wouldn't suspect her of stealing, why she needed to keep her hands visible in certain situations. Each word felt like lead in Frank's mouth, but he knew she needed to hear them. Later that night, Frank sat alone on the porch, a beer sweating in his hand. He took slow sips, letting the bitter taste linger. The crickets chirped in the darkness, a sound that usually brought him peace, but tonight it felt hollow. He thought about his friends' kids, white kids who never had to have these conversations. They didn't have to learn how to make themselves seem less threatening. They didn't have to worry about being seen as suspicious just for existing in their own neighborhoods. The weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. He'd protect Hope with everything he had, his life if necessary. But sitting there in the dark, that nagging question echoed in his mind. Would it ever be enough? Hope stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her fingers tugging at the unruly curls that refused to cooperate. "It's always messy," she groaned, shoulders slumping in defeat. Frank stood behind her, his own fingers still tangled in the remnants of what was supposed to be a braid. Despite Miss Ruby's patient lessons, his attempts at hairstyling remained clumsy at best. The scattered bobby pins and hair ties littering the counter told the story of their morning struggles. "I'm sorry, kiddo," he said, watching her frustration grow. "Maybe we need to try something different." He gently untangled his fingers from her hair, his heart aching at the sight of her disappointment. The next morning, Frank drove them to Riverside, the next town over. He'd heard about a black barbershop there, Jackson's hair studio. Hope pressed her face against the truck's window as they pulled into the parking lot, curiosity replacing her earlier irritation. The red and blue barber pole spun lazily in the morning sun, and the shop's windows gleamed with welcome. When they stepped inside, the buzz of clippers and casual chatter died down. Every head turned toward them, a white man and his black daughter standing in the doorway. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken questions. Some of the barbers exchanged meaningful looks while customers watched them through the mirrors. The scent of hair products and aftershave hung thick in the air. A barber with kind eyes and graying temples spoke up. "What can I do for y'all?" His name tag read Reggie. His crisp white smock was perfectly pressed, and his station was meticulously organized. Hope shrunk behind Frank's leg, suddenly shy, her small fingers gripping the fabric of his jeans. Frank placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "My daughter needs help with her hair," he said simply, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Reggie nodded slowly, gesturing to his chair. "Come on over, little lady." The leather squeaked invitingly as he patted the seat. As Hope settled into the big leather chair, Reggie draped a cape around her shoulders with practiced ease. He began working on her hair, his movements confident and gentle. The metal clips and combs clinked softly as he worked. "You know," he said, meeting Hope's eyes in the mirror, "your hair is beautiful. Our hair, it's special. It's got history." While his fingers worked through her curls, Reggie talked about Black culture, about pride, about the significance of hair in their community. He shared stories about his own daughter, about learning to embrace their natural beauty. Frank stood nearby, leaning against the wall, listening intently, aware that this was knowledge he could never provide on his own. His weathered hands were stuffed in his pockets, but his eyes never left Hope's face. The other customers and barbers gradually returned to their conversations, but now there were curious glances rather than suspicious ones. The atmosphere softened like butter in the sun. Hope began to relax, giggling as Reggie told jokes while weaving her hair into neat, intricate braids. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the silver threads in Reggie's hair. When Reggie finished, Hope's entire face lit up. She couldn't stop running her hands over the braids, twisting in the chair to see them from different angles. "I love it," she exclaimed, beaming at her reflection. Her eyes sparkled with newfound confidence. Frank reached for his wallet, but Reggie held up a hand. "First cut's on me, old man," he said with a slight smile. "You're trying. That counts for something." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. On the drive home, Hope sat in the back seat, humming quietly to herself. Her fingers kept tracing the patterns of her braids, and Frank could see her new confidence in the way she held herself. The morning sun caught her hair through the window, highlighting the intricate patterns Reggie had woven. Watching her in the rearview mirror, he understood that this wasn't just about hair. It was about identity, about belonging, about connecting with a part of herself that he, despite all his love and effort, couldn't fully help her explore. The purr of the truck's engine provided a gentle backdrop to his daughter's contentment. Days later, Hope burst through the front door, her backpack bouncing wildly against her back as she nearly tripped over her untied shoelaces in her rush. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she waved a crumpled piece of paper in front of Frank's face, practically vibrating with joy. "Daddy, Daddy, I got picked for the school play." Frank looked up from his newspaper, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes. "That so? I'm gonna be the princess." Hope twirled around the kitchen, her braids swinging through the air like ribbons in the wind. "Mrs. Patterson said I did the best reading. She said I had the clearest voice and everything. That's my girl." Frank's chest swelled with pride as he watched her dance around, already practicing her royal wave and adding little curtsies between spins. But 3 days later, everything changed. Hope trudged through the door, her shoulders slumped and her usual bounce gone, dragging her feet with each step. Frank knew something was wrong the moment she dropped her backpack by the door without a word, the thud echoing in the unusually quiet kitchen. "What's eating you, kiddo?" he asked, setting down the dish he was drying and turning to give her his full attention. Hope mumbled something, her eyes fixed on the floor, scuffing her shoe against the linoleum. "Can't hear you when you're talking to your shoes," Frank said gently, trying to catch her eye. "Mrs. Patterson changed her mind," Hope finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking slightly. "She said I should be the maid instead. Said the other part wasn't right for me anymore." Frank's hand tightened around the dish towel, twisting the fabric until his knuckles turned white. "Did she say why?" Hope shrugged, but tears were forming in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "She said it would suit me better, that I'd be more natural in that role." The dish towel dropped to the counter with a soft plop. Frank's jaw clenched so tight it hurt, a muscle twitching in his cheek. Without a word, he grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. The next morning, Frank marched into the school office as soon as they opened, his work boots echoing against the polished floors. The secretary tried to stop him, rising halfway from her chair with a protesting hand. But he was already halfway to Mrs. Patterson's classroom, determination in every step. The teacher looked up from her desk, startled by his entrance, papers scattering as she jumped. "Mr. Jackson, I dash. We need to talk about the play," Frank cut in, his voice level but firm as steel. Mrs. Patterson's hands fluttered nervously around her collar, straightening it unnecessarily. "Oh yes, well, I just thought the role would suit her better. You understand, don't you?" "Suit her better?" Frank's voice carried the weight of every slight Hope had ever faced, every sideways glance, every whispered comment. "My daughter earned that princess role fair and square. You're telling me she suddenly can't act anymore, that something changed in 3 days? Mr. Jackson, please understand." "No, you understand." Frank planted his hands on her desk, leaning forward, his shadow falling across her papers. "If you're picking parts based on skin, then you got no business teaching kids. Not my kid, not anybody's kid." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red as sunset. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish out of water. "Hope keeps the princess role," Frank said firmly, each word precise and measured. "Or we take this to the principal. Your choice, and believe me, I got plenty to say about how this went down." On the night of the play, Hope stood center stage in her glittering princess costume, standing tall and proud. Her tiara caught the stage lights, sending sparkles dancing across the auditorium like tiny stars. Frank sat in the front row, his hands already sore from clapping, his heart so full it might burst. When Hope delivered her final line, clear and strong, just like they'd practiced night after night at the kitchen table, Frank jumped to his feet, the chair scraping behind him. His applause thundered through the room, drowning out everyone else's, a father's love echoing off the walls. Hope's smile as she took her bow outshone every star in Georgia, and Frank knew he'd fight 1,000 more battles just to keep that smile shining. Frank's phone rang during a busy afternoon at the auto shop. His hands were deep in an engine, grease coating his weathered fingers, when Earl, his only remaining employee, called out from across the garage floor, "It's the school." His stomach dropped like a lead weight as he wiped his hands frantically on the shop rag and grabbed the phone. Minutes later, he was pulling up to Dawson Elementary in his old pickup truck, grease still staining his work shirt and the familiar worry gnawing at his insides. Hope sat on the wooden bench outside the principal's office, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her jaw set in a way that reminded him so much of himself. Her usually neat braids were slightly disheveled, and her Navy school uniform showed signs of a scuffle. "I didn't start it," she said before he could even open his mouth, her voice firm but trembling slightly, her dark eyes meeting his with fierce determination. Frank knelt beside her, noticing her scraped knuckles and the way she tried to hide them in the folds of her skirt. "Tell me what happened, kiddo." But before Hope could answer, Principal Davis's door opened with a sharp creak. "Mr. Jackson, please come in." Inside the office, Billy Thornton sat slumped in one of the hard plastic chairs with an ice pack against his face, his mother hovering beside him like an angry hen, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against her designer purse. The boy's eye was already turning purple, and he seemed to shrink further into his chair when Frank entered. "Your daughter attacked my son," Mrs. Thornton spat, her finger jabbing the air like a weapon. Her face was flushed red with indignation. Hope's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "He called me a—" She stopped, her lower lip quivering as she looked at Frank, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Called you what?" Frank asked quietly, though the fire in his gut told him he already knew. His heart ached at the pain in his daughter's eyes. When Hope whispered the word, the room went deadly silent. Frank's hands curled into fists at his sides, every muscle in his body tensing like a coiled spring. Years of practiced restraint being tested in that moment. Principal Davis cleared his throat, sweat beading on his forehead. "While we understand Hope might have been provoked, we have a strict no-violence policy." "Let me get this straight," Frank interrupted, his voice dangerously calm, each word measured and precise. "You're mad at her for defending herself, but not at him for what he said." "We discourage violence, Mr. Jackson," Davis stuttered, adjusting his tie nervously, his eyes darting between Frank and Mrs. Thornton. Frank leaned forward, planting his grease-stained hands on the principal's pristine desk. "Then start discouraging racism, too." Mrs. Thornton gasped, clutching her pearls. How dare you? My Billy would never. Your Billy just did. Frank cut her off, steel in his voice. And if you're raising him to think that's okay, then maybe you should be sitting in that chair instead of him. The drive home was quiet at first, the familiar streets of Dawson passing by in a blur. Hope stared out the window, her hands folded in her lap, until Frank finally spoke, his voice breaking through the heavy silence. I'm proud of you, he said softly, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Hope's head snapped around, surprise written across her features. Really? But I got in trouble. Sometimes trouble finds you when you're doing the right thing, Frank explained, his hands steady on the wheel. But next time, use your words first. That's your strongest weapon. A small smile tugged at Hope's lips, a glimpse of her usual spirit returning. But if I have to punch someone again? Frank couldn't help but chuckle, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. Make it count. Weeks later, Frank noticed the changes in Miss Ruby. The slight tremor in her hands when she poured coffee, the way she'd pause to catch her breath after climbing the diner's 3 front steps. Her usual brisk pace had slowed to a careful shuffle, though she'd snap at anyone who dared mention it. But it was Hope who said it out loud one evening after their weekly dinner at Ruby's house, where the food had been as delicious as always but the portions noticeably smaller. "Daddy," she whispered as they drove home, her 10-year-old face pinched with worry, the streetlights casting shadows across her features. "Miss Ruby doesn't look good." He couldn't argue. Ruby had been moving slower, her sharp wit still intact, but her energy fading like a dimming light. She'd taken to sitting more often during their visits, though she insisted it was just to rest her old bones. When the phone rang early one morning, Frank's heart sank before he even picked up, his hand trembling as he reached for the receiver. "It's Miss Ruby," the nurse said, her voice gentle but urgent. "She's asking for you and Hope." Hope grabbed Frank's arm as they walked through the sterile hospital corridors, her small fingers digging into his sleeve, leaving little crescents in the fabric. "She's gonna be okay, right?" Her voice trembled with the question, thick with unshed tears. Frank couldn't lie to her. "We'll see, kiddo." He squeezed her shoulder, trying to offer comfort he wasn't sure he felt himself. Ruby lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than Frank had ever seen her, the white sheets making her dark skin seem ashen, but her eyes still sparkled with that familiar defiance. "Y'all acting like I'm already dead," she croaked, managing a weak laugh that turned into a cough that shook her entire frame. Hope rushed to her bedside, taking Ruby's hand carefully, as if afraid it might break. Her small brown fingers intertwined with Ruby's weathered ones. Frank stood back, watching them together, seeing the love between this fierce woman who had guided them both and the little girl who had brought them all together, feeling the weight of what they might lose. But Ruby's spark continued to fade, like a candle burning down to its last bit of wick. Weeks passed, and despite Hope's daily prayers and Frank's gruff demands for the doctors to do more, his voice growing hoarse from arguing with nurses and specialists, Ruby slipped away quietly one night while the crickets sang outside her window. The funeral was held at the small Baptist church Ruby had attended her whole life, the white clapboard building filled with morning sunlight. People packed the pews, black and white, young and old, all touched by Ruby's unwavering spirit. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and the sound of quiet weeping. Hope wore the dress Ruby had helped her pick out for Easter, its yellow fabric bright against her skin, her braids done exactly the way Ruby had taught Frank, each one neat and even just like Ruby insisted they should be. When the preacher spoke about Ruby's life, about her courage and kindness, his voice carrying to the rafters, Hope buried her face in Frank's shirt, her tears leaving dark spots on the fabric. "She was my family too," she whispered through her tears, her small body shaking with grief. Frank wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Yeah, baby, she was." His voice was rough with emotion. That evening, they sat at their kitchen table, both staring at the empty chair where Ruby used to perch, telling stories and giving Frank grief about his cooking. The silence felt heavy, wrong in a space that Ruby had always filled with laughter and life. The tick of the clock on the wall seemed too loud in the quiet. Frank cleared his throat, fighting past the tightness there. She'd be mad if we sat around moping. Hope wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of wetness across her cheek. Then let's not. Together they pulled out the old cookbook Ruby had given Frank years ago, its pages stained and dog-eared, the spine cracked from use. They found her cornbread recipe, the one she'd made every Sunday after church, her neat handwriting filling the margins with extra notes and instructions. Hope measured the ingredients while Frank heated up the cast-iron skillet, just like Ruby had shown them, the heavy pan warming on the stove just as she'd insisted was the only proper way to do it. The autumn air was crisp as Frank and Hope walked up the church steps that Sunday morning. Hope's yellow dress, the one Ruby had helped pick out months ago, swished around her knees as she bounced with excitement. Frank tugged at his tie, feeling like it was choking him. He hadn't stepped foot in a church since Evelyn's funeral, but Ruby's words echoed in his mind. That girl needs a place to belong. As they pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the usual pre-service chatter died. Heads turned, and the silence felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Hope's small hand gripped Frank's tighter as they made their way down the aisle, their footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. They found a spot in the back pew, Hope smoothing her dress carefully as she sat. Frank could feel the stares, some curious, some friendly, others clearly disapproving. Mrs. Peterson, who used to bring him casseroles after Evelyn died, offered a small wave. But others, like old Bill Cooper, turned their backs pointedly. Pastor Matthews stood at the pulpit, his usual warm greeting faltering as his eyes landed on Frank and Hope. He cleared his throat twice before starting the sermon, his words somehow less confident than usual. After the final hymn, as people filed out, an elderly woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun approached them. Mrs. Cooper's thin lips pressed together in a tight line as she looked down at Hope. "You got a lot of nerve bringing that girl in here," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Frank's jaw clenched, his hand protectively finding Hope's shoulder. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "God ain't got favorites, Mrs. Cooper. If you got a problem, take it up with him." A black woman in her 30s, wearing a bright blue dress and a kind smile, stepped between them and Mrs. Cooper. She introduced herself as Sarah Whitmore, her warm eyes meeting Frank's without judgment. Mrs. Cooper huffed and walked away, but Sarah stayed, kneeling to Hope's level. "You know, we've got a wonderful children's program at Mount Zion Baptist across town. You both would be more than welcome there." Frank hesitated, but Hope's eyes lit up at Sarah's genuine smile. "Next Sunday?" she asked hopefully. Looking at his daughter's eager face, Frank nodded. "We'll be there." That evening, as Frank tucked Hope into bed, she smiled up at him. "I liked Sarah," she said softly. "She didn't look at us weird." Frank smoothed her blanket, nodding slowly. "Yeah, kiddo, she didn't." The following Sunday morning dawned bright and clear as Frank's old truck rumbled up to St. Mark's Baptist Church. The red brick building wasn't as grand as the other church, with its simple steeple reaching modestly toward the cloudless sky, but something about it felt more welcoming. Gospel music drifted through the open windows, the soulful voices carrying across the morning air, and the parking lot was filled with people greeting each other with hugs and warm smiles, their Sunday best catching the early light. As Frank and Hope walked up the worn concrete steps, several church members nodded and smiled, their faces genuine and inviting. "Welcome, welcome," called out a woman in a vibrant purple hat adorned with silk flowers, her face creasing with genuine warmth as she clutched her well-worn Bible to her chest. Sarah appeared at the heavy wooden door, wearing a cheerful yellow dress that seemed to capture the morning sunshine. "You made it." She knelt down to Hope's level, her eyes twinkling with kindness. "The other kids are in the Sunday school room playing games and making crafts. Would you like to join them?" Hope looked up at Frank, who nodded encouragingly, his weathered face softening. With a bright smile that lit up her whole face, she followed Sarah's directions down the hall, her footsteps quick and excited, her patent leather shoes clicking against the floor. "Come meet my father," Sarah said, leading Frank toward a tall man in crisp pastoral robes. Pastor Earl Whitmore had kind eyes crinkled at the corners and a firm handshake that spoke of years of greeting his congregation. "Welcome to St. Mark's, Brother Jackson. We've heard good things about you from Sarah. She speaks highly of your dedication as a father." The service began, and Frank found himself drawn into Pastor Whitmore's powerful sermon. The man spoke about found family, about how love transcends blood and race, his rich voice filling every corner of the sanctuary. "God doesn't see color when he looks at his children," Pastor Whitmore's voice rang out, resonating with conviction. "He sees hearts joined together in love and purpose. In his eyes, family is built on love, not just blood." Frank sat straighter in his pew, the words washing over him like a healing balm, each phrase seeming to speak directly to his situation. Around him, people nodded and called out, "Amen," with feeling, their voices rising and falling like waves. It wasn't the stiff, formal service he was used to. This was alive, vibrant, real, filled with genuine emotion and fellowship. After the service, Frank found Hope in the church basement, surrounded by other children her age. They were sharing cookies and juice, crumbs dotting their Sunday clothes as they laughed about something one of the boys had said. Hope's face was bright with joy, a kind of uninhibited happiness Frank hadn't seen in her for a long time, her eyes sparkling as she belonged among her peers. Sarah appeared beside him, watching the children with a soft smile playing on her lips. "You did good raising her, Mr. Jackson. She's got such a beautiful spirit about her." Frank felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying, like a knot finally coming undone. He watched his daughter, truly belonging somewhere for the first time, and exhaled slowly, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. On the drive home, Hope sat in the passenger seat, humming one of the hymns she'd learned, her sweet voice filling the cab of the truck. Her feet swung in rhythm against the seat, and her face glowed with contentment, the morning sun streaming through the window catching the beads in her braids. Frank gripped the steering wheel, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of acceptance settle over them both like a comfortable blanket. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't outsiders anymore. They had found their place, their people, their sanctuary. The Georgia winter settled over Dawson like a heavy blanket, bringing with it bitter winds and frozen mornings. Frank's auto shop stood quiet most days, the tools gathering dust, the empty bays echoing with memories of busier times. The calendar on the wall showed only 2 appointments for the entire week, both oil changes that wouldn't cover the heating bill. Frank sat at his desk, sorting through a stack of unpaid bills. The electricity warning notice glared up at him in angry red letters. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled on neighboring houses, their cheerful glow a stark contrast to the darkness of his own home. Hope pressed her face against the living room window that evening, her breath fogging up the glass as she watched the neighbors string up more decorations. "Daddy?" she asked, turning to Frank with those big brown eyes that always made his heart squeeze. "Why don't we have Christmas lights like the other houses?" Frank's wallet felt impossibly thin in his pocket. He'd been counting pennies just to keep food on the table. "Next year, kid," he said softly, hating the way disappointment flickered across her face. With work scarce in town, Frank started taking jobs wherever he could find them. He drove out to surrounding farms, fixing tractors and farm equipment for anyone who'd hire him. The work was hard, the pay was low, but it was something. One particularly cold afternoon, Frank finished repairing an old John Deere tractor belonging to Pete Matthews, a farmer just outside town. The job had taken 3 days of work in the freezing cold, his fingers nearly numb as he replaced the transmission. "That'll be $200, Frank said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Parts included." Matthews spat on the ground, his face twisting with contempt. "I ain't paying a trader," he sneered, the words hitting Frank like a physical blow. "Everyone knows what you're doing with that girl ain't right." Frank's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white with restraint. The old Frank would have thrown a punch, would have demanded what he was owed, but he thought of Hope waiting at home, thought of what she needed him to be. Without a word, he turned and walked away, the crunch of his boots on frozen ground the only sound in the bitter air. That night, Frank heated up 2 cans of tomato soup, stretching it with extra water to make it last. Hope sat at the kitchen table, watching him with those observant eyes that seemed to see right through him. She noticed the deep lines of exhaustion on his face, the way his shoulders slumped as he stirred the pot. While Frank was washing their bowls, Hope disappeared into her room. He heard the familiar sound of her crayons scratching against paper, followed by her light footsteps returning to the kitchen. "Look, Daddy," she said, holding up a piece of paper. On it, she'd drawn a Christmas tree, covered in colorful ornaments and topped with a bright yellow star. Little presents sat beneath its branches, and she'd even added twinkling lights in different colors. "We can put this up instead," Hope declared, reaching up on her tiptoes to tape it carefully to the kitchen wall. She stepped back, admiring her work with a proud smile. Frank stared at the drawing, at the love and hope contained in those crayon lines. Something caught in his throat as he looked at his daughter's attempt to bring Christmas into their home, to make things better in her own small way. He blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in his eyes. Reaching out, he ruffled her hair gently. "It's the best damn tree I've ever seen." The night before Christmas settled over Dawson with an eerie quiet. Snow had started falling, dusting the ground with white powder that muffled every sound, creating a blanket of silence that felt almost supernatural in its completeness. Frank and Hope sat in their living room, her crayon Christmas tree still proudly displayed on the wall, its childish lines and bright colors a testament to their small family's joy. They were sharing hot chocolate, marshmallows melting into creamy swirls when a heavy knock echoed through the house, shattering their peaceful moment. Frank's muscles tensed, his shoulders drawing tight beneath his worn flannel shirt. Nobody visited them these days, especially not at night. The town had made sure of that. He set down his mug with deliberate care and walked to the door, his footsteps careful and measured on the creaking floorboards. When he opened it, the cold air rushed in along with the sight of Earl Simmons swaying slightly on the porch, snowflakes catching in his graying hair. The smell of whiskey clung to Earl's breath as he steadied himself against the doorframe, his knuckles white from gripping the wood too hard. His eyes were glazed, but there was something sharp and mean in them, something that made Frank's jaw clench and his spine stiffen with familiar dread. "Earl," Frank said flatly, positioning himself firmly in the doorway. "What do you want?" Earl's gaze drifted past Frank into the house, taking in the modest decorations, the twinkling lights, and the drawing on the wall. His lip curled in unmistakable disgust. "You're still holding on to this, huh? Playing house like nothing's wrong?" Frank's fingers tightened on the doorknob until his knuckles matched Earl's. "If by this you mean my daughter, then yeah." His voice was low, warning, a father's protective growl. A harsh laugh escaped Earl's throat, ugly and raw. "Ain't your daughter, Jackson. She'll never really be yours." He took an unsteady step forward, bourbon fumes rolling off him in waves. "You can pretend all you want, but blood tells. Nature knows what's right, always has, always will." Frank felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous, like a pot about to boil over. His hands began to shake with the effort of controlling it, of holding back words that would only make things worse. "You can leave now before we both do something we'll regret." Earl's face twisted into a cruel smirk, his features distorted by shadow and malice. "You'll regret this one day. Mark my words." He turned, stumbling down the porch steps and disappearing into the swirling snow like a ghost returning to darkness. Frank slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. As he turned around, his heart sank to his boots at the sight of Hope standing in the hallway, her small figure half hidden in shadow, wearing the pink pajamas they'd picked out together at the store. Her eyes were wide with uncertainty, and something in her expression made Frank's anger dissolve into a deep, aching pain. "You are my daddy, right?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, small fingers twisting in the hem of her pajama top. Frank crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before her, his knees cracking against the hardwood floor. Looking into her eyes, those beautiful brown eyes that held his whole world, he spoke with fierce certainty. "Always. Don't you ever doubt that." He pulled her into a tight hug, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck, her heart beating fast against his chest. Nothing and no one is ever gonna change that, he whispered into her hair, holding her close as the snow continued to fall outside, nature painting its own picture of what belonged together. A blanket of pristine white snow covered Dawson, Georgia, transforming the small town into something out of a Christmas card. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the pearl gray sky, coating everything in a soft, magical silence. The bare branches of oak trees sagged under the weight of the unexpected snowfall, and icicles sparkled from the eaves of houses. Hope pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the winter wonderland unfold before her. "Daddy, look!" she called out, bouncing on her toes, her whole body vibrating with excitement. "It's real snow!" Frank looked up from his morning coffee, a smile tugging at his weathered face. Steam curled up from his favorite blue mug as he watched her enthusiasm. At 10 years old, Hope still had that spark of pure joy that made his heart swell. "Can we, Daddy? Can we play?" Hope was already pulling on her coat, mismatched mittens dangling from their strings, her fingers fumbling with the zipper in her rush. Frank set down his mug and grabbed his own jacket, the worn leather familiar against his skin. "I reckon I can spare a few minutes?" Outside, the cold air nipped at their faces as Hope scooped up handfuls of snow, packing them into wobbly balls. Her first throw caught Frank square in the chest, leaving a powder-white mark on his dark jacket, and her delighted laugh echoed across the yard, pure and sweet as church bells. "Oh, you're gonna get it now," Frank growled playfully, scooping up his own snowball and packing it with careful precision. They chased each other through the yard, ducking and dodging between the bare trees and snow-covered bushes. Hope's braids flew behind her as she darted between the trees, her giggles mixing with the soft crunch of snow under their boots. Her cheeks glowed pink with cold and happiness. For these precious moments, the world shrank to just the two of them. No judgmental stares, no whispered comments, just a father and daughter playing in the snow. The spell broke when two boys walked past their yard. Billy Thornton and his friend slowed down, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. Billy, who had grown meaner with age, his face already showing the hard lines of his father's prejudice, curled his lip into a familiar sneer. "Ain't she a little too dark for the snow?" he called out, his voice cutting through the peaceful morning like a knife, sharp with practiced cruelty. Hope stopped mid-throw, her snowball crumbling in her fingers like her joy itself was dissolving. The light drained from her face, replaced by a look Frank had seen too many times before, the look of a child being reminded she was different, that some people would always see her as less than. Frank turned toward the boys, his body tensing, shoulders squaring as he positioned himself between Hope and the threat. "Keep walking, Billy." His voice was low, carrying a warning that any smart person would heed, the kind of tone that promised consequences. Billy smirked, clearly pleased with the reaction he'd caused, his mean little victory written all over his face. "I was just saying." He nudged his friend, and they continued down the street, their laughter drifting back like poison in the pristine winter air. That evening, Hope pushed her food around her plate. The earlier happiness completely evaporated. Frank watched her from across the table, his heart heavy with the weight of her pain. The macaroni and cheese, usually her favorite, made with extra cheese just the way she liked it, sat untouched as she stared at nothing in particular, lost in thoughts no child should have to carry, her fork making aimless patterns in the cooling food. Days later, Hope bounced in her seat during breakfast, barely touching her eggs and toast. Her permission slip for the History Museum field trip sat proudly on the kitchen table, signed in Frank's careful handwriting. It was her first real trip outside of Dawson with her classmates, and she could hardly contain her excitement. Frank moved around the kitchen, packing her lunch with extra care. He added 2 chocolate chip cookies and her favorite apple juice box, then threw in a bag of pretzels for good measure. "Got everything?" he asked, zipping up her backpack. "Yes." Hope beamed, practically vibrating with anticipation. Frank helped her with her coat, his weathered hands adjusting the collar. "Be good, kiddo," he said, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. At the museum, Hope's class gathered in the grand entrance hall, their voices echoing off the marble floors. The tour guide, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, led them through exhibits about the town's founding, the Civil War, and local industries. As they moved from room to room, Hope noticed something odd. The guide talked about white settlers, white business owners, white politicians, but barely mentioned black people at all. When they passed a photograph of a black family from the 1800s, Hope raised her hand. "What about their story?" she asked, pointing to the picture. Mrs. Patterson let out an exasperated sigh. "That's not the focus of today's lesson, Hope. Let's keep moving." The group shuffled into the next room, which held an exhibit about slavery. Hope's stomach tightened as she read the placards. Behind her, she heard Billy Thornton snicker. "Hey, Hope," he whispered loud enough for others to hear. "Bet your granddaddy was a slave." Several kids laughed, their giggles bouncing off the museum walls. Hope's face burned hot with shame and anger. She felt their eyes on her, measuring her, judging her. The room suddenly felt too small, too crowded. "I need to use the bathroom," she mumbled, hurrying away before anyone could see the tears threatening to spill. That evening, Hope sat on the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The TV played quietly in the background, but she wasn't watching it. Frank noticed her mood as soon as he got home from work. He'd tried asking about the field trip during dinner, but she'd just pushed her food around her plate. He settled into his armchair, watching her with concerned eyes. "Want to talk about it?" Hope shook her head, her braids swaying slightly with the movement. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the low murmur of the television. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Do people really think I'm less than them?" Frank sighed heavily, running a calloused hand over his face. He turned to face her fully, his eyes serious and sad. "Some do," he admitted. "But they're wrong. You hear me?" Hope nodded, but her eyes told a different story. Frank could see it plain as day, that seed of doubt taking root, making her question her worth, her place in the world. She might have nodded, but a part of her still wondered. The morning mail arrived like any other day, dropping through the slot with a soft thud. Frank gathered the usual stack, bills, advertisements, and one peculiar envelope that made him pause. The paper was thick, expensive-looking, with elegant handwriting that flowed across the front. Hope Jackson. His fingers traced the return address from Atlanta, and something in his chest tightened. He stood in the kitchen, holding the envelope as if it might burn him, before calling out, "Hope? This one's for you, kid." Hope bounded down the stairs, her braids swinging. She rarely got mail except for birthday cards from Sarah at church. Frank watched her face as she took the envelope, noting how her eyes widened at the formal presentation. With careful fingers, Hope opened the letter. Frank couldn't help but notice how the paper looked crisp and professional, nothing like the lined notebook paper Hope usually used for her drawings. The room fell silent as her eyes moved across the words. Then he saw it, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breath caught. Hope looked up, her face a mixture of confusion and something else Frank couldn't quite read. "It's from my real mom," she said, her voice barely audible. Frank's stomach plummeted. He gripped the kitchen counter, trying to keep his face neutral despite the storm brewing inside him. He'd known this day might come, but nothing had prepared him for it. "Her name is Vanessa Jameson," Hope continued, still reading. "She lives in Atlanta. She's a lawyer." Her voice grew stronger with each detail. "She's been looking for me for years." Frank pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down heavily. Hope looked up again, her eyes wide and uncertain. "She says, she didn't abandon me. Someone took me from the hospital when I was born." The words hung in the air between them. Frank could see Hope struggling to process this information, to reconcile it with everything she'd known about herself. His throat felt dry as he asked, "Do you want to meet her?" Hope clutched the letter, her fingers crinkling the expensive paper. "I don't know," she whispered, looking lost. That evening, after Hope went to bed, Frank sat alone on the porch. The letter lay in his lap, its words seeming to mock him in the dim light. The night air was cool, but he barely noticed it. His thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the alley, finding Hope in the dumpster, how she'd grabbed his finger with her tiny hand, He picked up the letter again, studying Vanessa Jameson's perfect penmanship. A successful black lawyer from Atlanta. Everything he wasn't. Someone who could give Hope the understanding he couldn't, the connection to her culture he struggled with. Someone who shared her blood. Frank gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He knew this day would come. But sitting there, staring at the letter that could change everything, he wondered if he was ready for it. For 3 days, the letter lived in Hope's backpack, traveling with her everywhere like a secret she wasn't ready to share. Frank noticed how she'd pull it out during quiet moments, reading it over and over, her fingers tracing the elegant handwriting. Sometimes she'd fold it carefully, only to take it out again minutes later, as if the words might have changed. He wanted to ask, to help her sort through the confusion he saw in her eyes, but he knew this had to be her choice. At dinner on the 4th night, Hope pushed her mashed potatoes around her plate, gathering courage. The scrape of her fork against the ceramic filled the kitchen with nervous energy. Finally, she looked up at Frank, her voice small but determined. I want to meet her." Frank set down his fork, his heart thumping hard against his ribs. He'd been preparing for this answer, rehearsing it in his mind late at night, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. Still, he kept his voice steady, gentle. "All right, then we'll do it together." The drive to Atlanta stretched longer than usual, each mile marker seeming further apart than the last. Hope sat in the passenger seat, fidgeting with her dress, the yellow one she wore to church, freshly ironed the night before. Frank had helped her braid her hair that morning, his fingers steadier than his nerves, weaving each strand with extra care. The city skyline grew larger through the windshield, modern buildings reaching toward the clouds like glass giants. The restaurant Vanessa had chosen was fancy, the kind with cloth napkins and multiple forks, with soft jazz playing in the background. As they walked from the parking lot, Hope's hand found Frank's, squeezing tight. Her palm was damp with nervousness. There, waiting by the entrance, stood a woman in a tailored navy blue dress, her heels clicking against the pavement as she shifted her weight. Frank felt Hope's breath catch. The resemblance was striking, almost haunting. Vanessa had the same high cheekbones as Hope, the same warm brown eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 thoughts. Her hair was styled in elegant twists, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone used to commanding rooms, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. "Hope?" Vanessa's voice was soft, trembling slightly with emotion, as if she'd practiced saying that name 1,000,000 times, but still couldn't believe she was finally speaking it aloud. Hope hesitated, her grip on Frank's hand tightening until he could feel her pulse through her fingers. Then, slowly, like a butterfly testing its wings, she stepped forward. The hostess led them to a private table in the corner, tucked away from curious eyes. Vanessa ordered sparkling water, while Frank asked for plain. Hope sat between them, looking small in the fancy chair, her feet barely touching the floor. "I've been searching for you for so long," Vanessa said, her eyes never leaving Hope's face, drinking in every detail. She explained about the corrupt hospital worker who had stolen Hope, about the years of private investigators and dead ends, about nights spent wondering and worrying. "I never stopped looking. I need you to know that." Hope nodded, but her eyes kept darting between Vanessa and Frank, like a compass needle searching for true north. She listened as Vanessa talked about her law practice, about the beautiful house she owned in Buckhead with its garden full of roses, about all the things she wanted to share with Hope. But Frank could see the confusion in his daughter's face, the struggle to reconcile this elegant stranger with the life she knew, filled with garage grease and homemade pancakes. The drive home was quiet, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt. Hope stared out the window, lost in thought, her reflection ghosted against the dark glass. The sun had set, leaving them in the soft darkness of evening, streetlights painting streaks across the dashboard. Finally, her small voice broke the silence. "She's nice, but she's not you." Frank gripped the steering wheel harder, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. His knuckles turned white with the effort of keeping his emotions in check. He didn't know what was coming next, but Hope was still his daughter. That was enough for now, enough to keep his world turning on its axis. A week had passed since the meeting with Vanessa, and the Jackson household felt different. The usual warmth of their morning routine was tinged with an unfamiliar tension. Hope moved through the kitchen like a ghost, picking at her breakfast, her eyes often drifting to the letter that sat on the counter, Vanessa's elegant handwriting visible through the thin envelope. Frank watched her from the stove, flipping pancakes that were slightly burned around the edges. His daughter's silence weighed heavy on his heart. Finally, as he set a plate in front of her, he couldn't hold back anymore. "What's on your mind, kid?" Hope pushed a piece of pancake around her plate, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I just don't know where I fit." At school, the questions came fast and relentless. Kids who had never paid much attention to Hope before suddenly crowded around her desk during lunch. "So, are you going to live in Atlanta now?" Tommy Peters asked, mouth full of sandwich. "Is your real mom rich?" Jessica Miller chimed in, eyes wide with curiosity. Each question felt like a small cut, making Hope sink further into herself. She loved her life with Frank. The smell of motor oil that always clung to his clothes, their Saturday morning cartoons, the way he hummed off-key while doing dishes. But now there was Vanessa with her perfect house and garden full of roses, offering a glimpse into a different life, one where she might have grown up looking like everyone else in her family. That afternoon, Hope sat on the church steps watching cars pass by on the quiet street. She didn't hear Sarah Whitmore approach until the woman settled beside her, smoothing her dress as she sat. "Heavy thoughts?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. Hope nodded, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. Sarah watched a bird hop across the sidewalk before speaking again. "It's okay to have two families, Hope," she said softly. "But don't let anyone make you feel like you have to choose." The words settled over Hope like a warm blanket, giving voice to something she hadn't been able to express. That evening, Hope found Frank on the couch, pretending to read the newspaper but really just staring at the same page. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The familiar smell of his aftershave mixed with motor oil wrapped around her like a comfort blanket. "Can I see her again?" Hope asked, her voice small but steady. Frank lowered the newspaper slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing both the baby he'd found in that alley and the young girl she was becoming. His heart clenched tight in his chest, but he nodded. "If that's what you want, then we'll do it." The sleek black Mercedes rolled through the iron gates of an exclusive Atlanta neighborhood, Frank's old pickup truck following behind like a humble shadow. Hope pressed her face against the window, counting the mansions that lined the street until they reached Vanessa's house. Her jaw dropped at the sight of the 3-story colonial home with its pristine white columns and manicured lawn. "She lives here?" Hope whispered, her eyes wide as saucers. Frank parked the truck, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel a moment longer than necessary. "Sure does, kiddo." Inside, the house felt like a museum. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and Hope's shoes sank into thick carpets. Vanessa, elegant in a silk blouse, welcomed them warmly before introducing her husband Charles, a distinguished-looking man in wire-rimmed glasses, and Malcolm, Hope's half-brother. Malcolm, tall and lanky at 15, offered a polite hey before returning to his phone. Hope noticed how his designer clothes matched the expensive furniture around him. During dinner, served by a housekeeper on fine china, Vanessa shared stories about her life. She spoke of summers in Martha's Vineyard, Malcolm's private school in Connecticut, and charity galas where she served on the board. "Last year we took Malcolm to Paris for his birthday," Vanessa said, her voice warm with memory. "The culture there is just incredible." Hope pushed her perfectly cooked salmon around her plate, stealing glances at Frank. His calloused hands looked out of place against the delicate silverware, and he sat stiffly in his chair, as if afraid to lean back. "I wish I could have given you all of this," Vanessa said softly, reaching across to touch Hope's hand. "The opportunities, the experiences." Hope looked at Frank across the table, watching his fingers tighten around his fork. She felt something twist in her stomach, not quite sadness, not quite anger, but a strange mix of both. The drive home was quiet, streetlights casting shadows across their faces. When they finally pulled into their driveway, the familiar sight of their modest house with its peeling paint felt both comforting and strange. Hope followed Frank inside, watching him hang his keys on the hook by the door, the same routine they'd had for years. "Do you ever wish you were rich, Daddy?" she asked suddenly. Frank chuckled, running a hand through his graying hair. "Would have been nice, but money don't make a family, kid." Hope nodded, understanding settling in her chest like a warm blanket. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Frank was under a Chevy fixing a transmission when his cell phone rang. He slid out, wiping his hands on a rag before answering. "Mr. Jackson?" A crisp, professional voice spoke. "This is David Mitchell from Mitchell and Associates Law Firm. I'm calling regarding Hope Jackson." Frank's heart stopped. "What about her?" "Ms. Vanessa Jameson has filed for joint custody. We'll be serving you the papers tomorrow." The wrench in Frank's hand clattered to the floor. "She wants to take her?" Hope, who had been doing homework in the office, appeared in the doorway. Her face went pale as she heard Frank's words. "I don't want to leave," and she cried out, rushing to Frank's side. "Daddy, I don't want to go." Frank wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Nobody's taking you anywhere, kiddo." The courtroom was packed 2 weeks later. Frank sat with his lawyer, a public defender named Sarah Martinez, while Vanessa's legal team filled the other table with expensive suits and leather briefcases. Vanessa took the stand first, her voice measured and calm. "I only want what's best for Hope. With my resources, I can provide opportunities she'll never have in Dawson. Private schools, cultural experiences, connections that will benefit her future." When it was Frank's turn, he spoke from his heart. "I may not have money, but I've given that girl everything I got. Every scraped knee, every nightmare, every triumph, I was there. Love ain't measured in dollar signs." The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Williams, called Hope forward. At 12, Hope looked small in the witness stand, but her voice rang clear. "Hope," Judge Williams said gently, "you're old enough to have a say in this. What do you want?" Hope looked between Vanessa and Frank. Vanessa sat perfectly poised, hopeful. Frank's hands were clasped tight, his face lined with worry. "I love you, Vanessa," Hope said carefully. "But Frank is my father." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Williams nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony," she announced, "I rule in favor of Mr. Jackson maintaining full custody, with Ms. Jameson granted visitation rights to be arranged between both parties." Frank's shoulders sagged with relief. Outside the courthouse, Hope grabbed his hand, her grip firm and sure. "Let's go home," she said. Frank finally exhaled, years of tension leaving his body. Home. Where she belongs. Years later. The spring sun shone brightly over the university campus as Hope Jackson, now 24, stood among her fellow graduates. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces in the crowd until they landed on a familiar figure. Frank Jackson, 73 now, wearing his best navy blue suit. His hair had turned completely white, but his eyes still held that same fierce pride she'd known all her life. After the ceremony, Hope made her way through the crowd, her black graduation gown flowing behind her. When she reached Frank, she saw him dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. "I did it, Daddy," she said, wrapping her arms around him. Frank hugged her tight, his voice gruff with emotion. "Never doubted you would, kid." The drive back to Dawson was quiet, filled with comfortable silence and memories. They passed familiar landmarks, including Frank's old auto shop. The building stood empty now, its windows dusty, the Jackson's Auto Repair sign faded but still visible. Hope remembered doing her homework there, the smell of motor oil, and the sound of tools clanking against metal. When they arrived home, Frank eased himself into his favorite armchair, wincing slightly. Hope noticed his movements were slower these days, more careful. She rushed to help him, but he waved her off with a chuckle. "I ain't dead yet," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Just getting a little rusty in the joints is all." That evening, Hope sat beside Frank's bed as he drifted off to sleep. The same bedroom where he'd read her stories, checked for monsters under the bed, and dried her tears after tough days at school. She watched his chest rise and fall, thinking about all the battles he'd fought for her, all the love he'd given without hesitation. "You were never my blood," she whispered, "but you were always my father." Outside their home, a new plaque stood in the front yard, recently placed there by the town council, a town that had finally recognized what true love looked like. The bronze inscription read, "Frank Jackson, a man who fought for love over blood. If you enjoyed the story of Frank and Hope, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it."